The celestial Accord station hung in the middle of deep space, like someone had taken a handful of stars and pressed them into metal and glass. From the outside, it looked like a city that had forgotten it was supposed to be on a planet. From inside, it was louder, brighter, and more chaotic than any city had a right to be. Every corridor was packed. Every deck was alive. The Festival of the United Worlds only happened once every 7 years, and every species that had managed to claw its way into the galactic community showed up for it, whether they were invited or not. There were merchants selling things that had no name in most languages. There were diplomats in robes that cost more than small ships. There were soldiers in ceremonial armor that had never seen a real battle, standing very straight and trying to look important. And then there was Princess Kaith. She did not walk through the corridors, so much as move through them the way a storm moves through a valley. Everything adjusted around her. Conversations stopped. Bodies shifted. Eyes dropped. 7 feet tall with 4 arms that moved like they had their own thoughts. Skin the color of dark silver that caught the station lights and held them. Eyes that burned a deep, steady gold. She was the heir to the Thyron Dominion, which had not lost a war in 400 years, and she carried that fact in every step she took. Behind her walked 12 of her finest warriors in ceremonial armor. Ahead of her walked absolutely nobody, because nobody who had any sense wanted to be the thing standing between Princess Kaith and wherever she was going. Her commander, Vorson, kept pace at her right side. He was older than her by 30 years and had spent most of those years watching her be exactly this. Unstoppable, certain, right about almost everything, which made her very difficult to argue with. The observation deck was the largest public space on the station. It stretched out over a view of open space on one side and looked down into the main arena on the other. And today, every spot along the railing was taken. The combat exhibitions were the most popular event of the festival. Warriors from 40 species had entered. The betting pools were enormous. Everyone already knew who was going to win. The Thyron fighters had not lost an exhibition in 11 consecutive festivals, and there was no serious reason to think today would be different. Kaith was scanning the crowd the way she always did in public spaces, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. She noticed things. It was one of the qualities that made her exceptional. She noticed the nervous glances her entourage drew from other species. She noticed which ambassadors bowed and which ones only nodded and filed that information away. She noticed which of her warriors were walking too loosely and would need to be reminded about posture later. And she noticed him. He was sitting alone at a small bar in the far corner of the observation deck, away from the noise and the crowds and the color of the festival, not hiding exactly, but not participating either. Just sitting. He had a drink in his hand, and his eyes were on one of the smaller screens that showed the arena floor below, and he had the specific kind of stillness that most people never achieve. Not the stillness of boredom, not the stillness of someone trying to look calm. The real kind. The kind that comes from being completely comfortable with silence. He was human. Kaith had encountered humans before, in diplomatic settings, in passing, in historical records. They were a young species by galactic standards, barely a few centuries into the broader community, and they were not physically impressive by any measure that mattered. Shorter than most species, soft compared to most species. They had 2 arms, which always struck Thyron observers as a strange limitation, like a craftsman working with half the tools. They lived short lives, and they got sick, and they broke easily, and somehow, despite all that, they had carved out a significant piece of the galaxy for themselves and held it, which was something nobody had quite been able to explain. This one was somewhere in the middle portion of what humans considered a lifespan. His hair was dark with gray beginning to show at the sides. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years that had not always been easy. He wore plain civilian clothes with no rank markings, no insignia, nothing to indicate who he was or where he had come from. He looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that he did not need the world to know his name. Kaith made a decision the way she made most decisions, which was immediately and without asking anyone's opinion. She walked over. He did not look up as she approached. This was unusual. Most beings in a crowded room noticed a 7-foot 4-armed silver-skinned princess moving toward them. He either had not noticed or had noticed and did not consider worth reacting to. Both options were interesting. She stopped in front of him. "You are human," she said. He looked up then. His eyes were a pale gray, the color of sky before rain, and they met hers without flinching, without the quick flicker of fear or the overcompensating brightness of someone trying to appear unafraid. He just looked at her the way you look at someone who has said something obvious. "Last I checked," he said. "Name's Cole. You need something?" Behind her, Vorson made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. Her warriors were less restrained. The idea that a human, alone, with no guards, no weapons visible, and no apparent awareness of who he was talking to, had just responded to the princess of the Thyron Dominion with the equivalent of, "What do you want?" was genuinely funny to them. Kaith, to her credit, was not offended. She was interested. "I propose a sparring match," she said, "between our species, for cultural exchange and mutual understanding." Cole looked at her for a moment, the way you look at a math problem you already know the answer to. "I'm retired," he said. "Pass." A human refusing a princess. A human respecting his own schedule, he said, and picked up his drink. She leaned in slightly. "Unless your species lacks the courage." The laughter from her entourage sharpened. A few of them exchanged glances that said this was going to be the easiest humiliation of the festival. Cole set his drink down. He looked up at her, and for just a moment something moved behind those gray eyes, something old and quiet and completely serious, and Kay felt the very edges of the thought that maybe Vorson should have been closer to her right now. Then it was gone. "You really don't want this," Cole said, and his voice was not threatening. It was just honest, the way a doctor is honest. The laughter got louder. Kate smiled wider. "1 hour," she said. "Main arena." Cole looked at her for another long second. Then he exhaled slowly, the way a man accepts bad weather. 1 hour, he agreed. "But you asked for it. Remember that." Kate walked away with the easy confidence of someone who has never lost and cannot imagine starting now. The crowd that had gathered parted for her. People were already talking about the match, already laughing, already deciding it would be the most entertaining 2 minutes of the festival. 1 hour later, the main arena was full. 20,000 beings packed into every seat, every standing space, every available surface. The screen showed Princess Kaith entering from the east gate in full ceremonial armor, for blades ready, moving like something out of a war painting. The crowd was loud enough to feel in your chest. Then the west gate opened. Cole walked in wearing the exact same clothes he had been wearing at the bar. No armor, no weapons, nothing in his hands. He looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong event at a conference. The crowd noise dropped into confused murmuring. The commentator, a veteran of 11 festivals, leaned slowly toward his microphone. "He has," the commentator said carefully, "no weapons, no armor." A pause. "Is this a human ritual of some kind? Possibly a formal surrender ceremony?" His co-host squinted at the screen. "I think," he said, "he just forgot." In the Royal Observation Box, Commander Vorson was not watching the arena. He was staring at his datapad, at the file he had pulled 20 minutes ago, when a contact in the station security office had recognized the name Cole had given at the welcome desk. The file was flagged in red at every level. He had needed 3 separate clearance codes to open it, and even then 2 sections were blacked out entirely. Cole R. Classification, Restricted Unit. 7th Frontier Response Division status. Mandatory retirement reason. Threat assessment exceeded containment parameters. Subject cleared for civilian transition. Reactivation prohibited without Joint Command authorization. Below that, a list of operational citations that Vorson read twice, because he could not believe them the first time. He looked up at his princess, standing in the center of the arena below, radiant, confident, smiling at the small plain-clothed human, walking toward her like she had already won. He reached for his comm and called her channel. The line was silent. She had turned it off, like she always did before a fight, because she believed real warriors needed no advice once the moment came. Vorson lowered his comm and watched. The thing about Princess Kaith was that she had never needed to think before attacking. Thinking was for fighters who were not sure they would win. Kaith was always sure. She had been trained since she could walk by the best combat instructors the Thyron Dominion could find, and she had outgrown every single one of them by the time she was 15. She had 4 arms, each one capable of independent action, each one trained to a level that most warriors spend entire careers trying to reach. She was fast in a way that made other fast things look slow. She hit hard in a way that ended conversations permanently. So she attacked first because she always did, and because there had never been a single reason not to. All 4 blades came out at once, plasma-edged, humming with a quiet heat that you could feel from 3 feet away. She moved into her opening pattern, the one she had used 300 times against 300 opponents, the one that worked because it came from every angle at the same moment and left absolutely no logical place to go. It was not one attack. It was a situation, a problem with no solution. Every fighter she had ever faced had responded to it the same way, by trying to block, by trying to retreat, by trying to find an answer that did not exist. Cole stepped left, not back, not into a defensive stance, just left, one clean step, and the first blade passed his right ear close enough that it should have terrified him. His right hand came up and caught her second arm at the wrist, not grabbing it, just redirecting it, like he was moving a door that was swinging too fast. His elbow met her third arm and nudged it off its line. The fourth blade, he simply was not where it was going. 2 seconds, maybe less. Kate found herself slightly forward, slightly off balance. Her 4-part attack dissolved into nothing, and Cole was already standing outside her reach looking at her with those gray eyes like he was reading a map he had seen before. The stadium went silent. 20,000 beings packed into every seat and standing space, and not one of them made a sound. The commentator, who had been talking continuously for 6 hours and had never once run out of things to say, stopped mid-sentence and did not start again for a long moment. "He's not fighting her," he finally said, very quietly, like he was talking to himself. "He's solving her." Kate reset. She was not rattled. Not yet. Because one exchange meant nothing and she had trained for opponents who surprised her in the first moments. She came again, harder this time, more committed, pushing the speed up to the level where her strikes became genuinely difficult to track even on the high-speed cameras the station used for broadcast. Cole took a hit. It caught him across the ribs on his left side, and the sound it made was not a good sound. It was the sound of something giving way. The crowd made a noise that was part wince and part the specific excitement that comes from watching something go wrong. And Keith pressed forward because this was the moment. This was always the moment when the opponent started feeling the cost, and the doubt crept in, and the fight was as good as done. Cole smiled. Not a pained smile. Not the desperate grin of someone trying to pretend they were fine. A real one, small and quiet, like something that just confirmed the thought he had been having. Keith stopped. In 300 fights across 15 years of competition, no opponent had ever smiled after taking that hit. Not one, because that hit hurt. She knew exactly how much it hurt because she had designed the strike specifically to make continuing feel like a choice no reasonable being would make. It was the kind of hit that talked to you, that said, clearly and without room for argument, that things were only going to get worse from here, and you should seriously consider your options. Cole's smile said he had considered his options and found them acceptable. Something shifted in the arena. Kate felt it before she understood it. The crowd felt it too. 20,000 beings leaning forward in their seats without realizing they were doing it, drawn towards something they could not name yet. What happened over the next 10 minutes was not a fight in any sense that most species would recognize. It was not elegant. There were no beautiful exchanges of technique, no moments that would make the highlight recordings. No choreography. Cole did not move like a warrior. He moved like something that had made a very simple decision at some point before the match started, which was that he was going to be standing at the end of this regardless of what it cost him, and everything else was just details. He absorbed punishment that should have slowed him and didn't. He took hits and moved through them instead of away from them, eating the cost, staying in range, staying in the problem. Every time Kate used her 4 arms as the advantage they were, something went slightly wrong. When she attacked from 2 directions at once, he moved to a position where the angles worked against each other, and she almost hit herself. When she used her height to drive him down, he went down willingly and made the lower position work in ways she had not planned for. When she went lower to match him, the ground itself became something she had to think about, edges and surfaces and balance points that Cole seemed to understand better than she did despite the fact that this was her arena, not his. She started adjusting. That was the thing about Keith. the thing that had kept her undefeated for 15 years. She was not just fast and strong and trained. She was smart. She could read a fight and change mid-pattern and find new approaches while the old ones were still failing. She had done it dozens of times against opponents who thought surprising her in the first exchange meant they had a chance. She adjusted. Cole adjusted to her adjustment. She adjusted again. He was already somewhere else. It was like trying to solve a problem that rewrote itself every time you got close to the answer. The crowd had stopped making the noise crowds usually make at combat exhibitions. The cheerful roar, the excitement of watching impressive athletes do impressive things. It had gone somewhere quieter and more serious. The sound of 20,000 beings watching something they did not fully understand and feeling, without being able to explain why, that they were seeing something important. Vorson had put his data pad down. He was gripping the railing of the royal box with 2 of his 4 hands and watching without blinking. At the 12-minute mark, Kaith made a decision she had never made in 300 fights. She committed everything. Full speed, full strength, all 4 blades. No held reserve, no second plan. Sometimes you encounter a problem you could not solve by being careful, and the only answer was to be so fast and so overwhelming that the problem simply did not have time to exist anymore. She had used this exactly twice before. Both times it had worked. She moved. Cole moved with her, not against her, taking her momentum in her direction and doing something with the geometry of it that she understood only after it was already done. For a moment, she was moving very fast in a direction that was not the direction she had intended, and then the world reoriented itself, and she was still, and there was something at her throat, 2 fingers, resting there lightly, right at the point where the pulse ran close to the surface, and where, if those fingers had been blade or had pressed with any real intention, the fight would have been over in the most permanent way. She felt Cole's breath near her ear, even, steady, like someone who had gone for a moderate walk. Then the fingers lifted. His footsteps moved away. He walked back toward the center of the arena, not in triumph, not performing anything for crowd, just walking, the way you walk when something is finished and you would like to sit down. The commentator's microphone had been live the entire time. The silence had been broadcast every screen on the station, to the overflow rooms, to the ship's dock, to the outer rings that had been watching the feed. Winner, the commentator said finally. His voice had the specific quality of a being who has just discovered that something they were completely certain about is not true, is the human. He said it the way you say something, when you need to hear it out loud to believe it. Kay stood in the center of the arena, breathing harder than she had breathed in years. Her 4 blades were still in her hands, and she was looking at the space where Cole had been standing, then at the exit he had walked through, then at nothing in particular. In the royal box, Vorson slowly released the railing. The crowd was silent for 3 full seconds, which in a stadium of 20,000 beings is a very long time. Then the noise came, not the clean roar of appreciation, but something more confused and more honest. The sound of 20,000 different reactions happening at once. Shock, disbelief, something that in some species would be called awe and in others had no name at all. Nobody laughed, not one being in that stadium. Not her warriors, not the commentators, not the diplomatic observers in their expensive seats, not the soldiers who had come here representing species that considered themselves proud martial traditions. Nobody laughed. 2 hours after the fight, the station had mostly gone back to being a festival. That was the thing about large gatherings of many different species. Something remarkable could happen, something that made 20,000 beings go completely silent. And then within 2 hours, the food stalls were busy again, and the music was playing, and people were talking about the next event. The universe was large and full of things to pay attention to, and most species had learned, out of simple necessity, not to dwell too long on any one thing. The talk about the fight was everywhere, though. Cole had become a name on every deck of the station, in the corridors, in the dining areas, in the quiet corners where diplomats traded information like currency. Most of the conversation had the quality of people trying to explain something they did not have the right words for yet. Some species were dismissive, insisting there had to be a technical explanation, some advantage that had not been visible on the broadcast. Some were quiet in the way that meant they were thinking harder than they wanted to let on. In the main observation lounge, which was the largest social space on the upper level of the station, the mood had settled into the comfortable noise of an event winding toward its evening hours. Drinks were being served. Small groups of ambassadors were doing the careful dance of diplomatic small talk, which is the art of saying almost nothing while appearing to say a great deal. Cole was in his corner again, same seat, same kind of drink, watching the station go back to normal around him like he had expected it to. Then every screen in the lounge changed at once. The festival programming cut out and was replaced by a single block of text in emergency broadcast format that every species in the galactic community had agreed to recognize. Red background, white letters. The alert tone that played before was designed to be heard by as many different auditory systems as possible, and it cut through the noise of the lounge like a knife through paper. Priority 1 distress colony. Hargrove's reach population. Human settlement situation. Under attack aggressors. Kreth Empire forces all capable vessels in range requested. The lounge went quiet the way it had gone quiet in the arena, that specific silence that falls when something lands that everyone needs a moment to process. Then the murmuring started. The Kreth Empire. Even beings who had no direct experience with them knew the name. For star systems worth of territory held by a military force that had not lost a significant engagement in over 2 centuries. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. Conquerors take things and hold them, and build something on top of what they have taken. The Kreth were more efficient than that. They identified resistance. They calculated the cost of allowing it to continue, and they removed it, completely and permanently, and with a thoroughness that left nothing behind that could grow back into a problem later. They did not raid. They erased. Hargrove's Reach was a small colony on the outer edge of human claimed space. 40,000 people, most of them settlers who had gone out there for the same reasons humans always went to the edges of things, for space, for quiet, for a particular kind of freedom that comes from being far from the center of everything. There was no military garrison. There was a small security force and some defensive infrastructure that had been built with pirates and opportunists in mind, not a full imperial military engagement. Against the Kreth, 40,000 people with no garrison was not a difficult problem. It was barely a problem at all. Lord Vorith, the Kreth ambassador to the Festival of United Worlds, was seated at a large table near the center of the lounge with several members of his diplomatic staff. He was a tall being with pale gray skin and eyes that were a darker gray, flat and without warmth, the eyes of someone that had learned to perform patience without ever actually feeling it. He looked at the emergency broadcast on the screen for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his formal robes, and addressed the room with the ease of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. "A tragedy," he said. His voice carried well. It was designed to carry well. Truly. But one must be realistic about these situations. He looked around the lounge, meeting eyes where he could, letting the pause do the work that words would have done less cleanly. Hargrove's reaches far from any major military presence. The Empire's engagement there is, I am told, a response to certain provocations that the human colonial authority had been warned about repeatedly. Another pause. But regardless of the cause, one must ask practically, who here would risk a war with the Empire over one small human colony? Who has the ships, the willingness, the strategic interest? He looked around the room again. The silence that answered him was the silence of beings doing the math, and not liking the answer they kept arriving at. Vorith sat back down. It was a good moment for him. He had clearly been looking forward to it. Then someone near the back of the lounge said, in a confused voice, "Where did the human go?" Several people looked toward the corner table. The seat was empty. The glass was there, nearly finished, set down neatly. Cole was not. Nobody had seen him leave. Nobody had seen him stand up or move toward the exit. He had simply stopped being in the room at some point between the emergency broadcast appearing on the screens and Vorith finishing his speech, which meant he had left very quickly, or had been moving before most people in the room had fully processed what they were reading. Vorson had noticed. Vorson had been keeping one eye on that corner table since the broadcast appeared, and he had seen Cole set down his drink and walk out with the unhurried pace of someone who had already decided what they were doing and saw no reason to make a production of it. He followed. Docking Bay 7 was one of the smaller private bays on the station's lower level, used mostly for personal vessels and short-range transports. It was quieter than the main bays, fewer staff, less traffic. The kind of place you went when you did not particularly want company. Cole was at a storage locker along the far wall, the kind that long-term visitors rented for equipment they did not want to carry around the station. The case he had pulled out was dark gray and unmarked and moderately large, and was open on the floor beside him. Vorson could see the contents from 10 feet away. He had spent enough years in military service to recognize what he was looking at. Those were not the belongings of a retired man. "Cole," Vorson said. Cole did not startle. He had heard the footsteps. He looked up from what he was doing with the calm of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "Commander, I read your file," Vorson said. He stopped a few feet away. "The parts one could access. Then you know I'm retired. It says you cannot be reactivated through official channels," Vorson said carefully. "It does not say you won't act on your own." Cole looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind those gray eyes. A brief acknowledgement that Vorson was smarter than the average person who would try to have this conversation with him. "There a difference?" he said. "How many will you call?" Cole closed the case. He thought about it with the specific quality of someone doing a real calculation, not performing consideration, but actually working through numbers in their head. "Enough," he said. Vorson looked at the case, looked at Cole. He was a military man who had spent 40 years serving a princess he believed in, representing a dominion he was genuinely proud of, and he understood duty in a way that went all the way down to the bone. He understood it well enough to recognize it in someone else, even when it was dressed in civilian clothes and carrying an unmarked case in a quiet docking bay. He nodded once, slowly, said nothing else. The footsteps behind them were quiet enough that most beings would not have heard them until they were much closer. Cole heard them at the entrance to the bay. Vorson turned a moment later. Princess Kay stood in the doorway. She had changed out of her ceremonial armor. She was wearing plain clothes, dark and simple, nothing that identified her rank or her name. No entourage behind her, no warriors at her back, no Vorson at her side because Vorson was already here and she had apparently followed him without him knowing, which was either impressive or unsettling depending on how you thought about it. She looked different without the armor and the ceremony. Not smaller exactly. She was still 7 feet tall with 4 arms and eyes that burned gold, but more present somehow, more real. Cole studied her face for a long moment. He was reading something there, checking for something, and whatever he found either satisfied him or at least did not concern him enough to change anything. "This isn't a sparring match," he said. "I know," Kay said. The 2 words were simple, and she said them simply, and there was nothing in her voice that asked for anything. No request for permission, no performance of seriousness, no explanation of why she was here or what she wanted. Just the 2 words, which were really a single statement about the fact that she understood exactly what she was walking into and had walked into it anyway. Cole looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his case and nodded once. The small kind of nod that means something has been settled without needing to be discussed. "Don't get in the way," he said. Keith repeated the words back slowly, the way you repeat something in a language you are still learning, tasting the shape of it. "Don't get in the way," she said. She had given orders her entire life. She had never in her life been given one. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind. Hargrove's reach looked worse from the ground than it had on the scanner. The colony was not a large place by any standard. A few hundred buildings spread across a valley between 2 low mountain ridges, with a river running through the southern end and farmland stretching out to the east. The kind of place that people built when they wanted something quiet and honest, when they were tired of the noise of bigger worlds and just wanted to grow things and raise families and watch the sky go dark at night without anything complicated happening. The sky above it now had crest ships in it, 5 of them visible from the approach. Heavy military vessels sitting in low orbit with the casual confidence of something that does not expect to be challenged. On the ground, smoke was rising from the northern district where the communication tower had been. The streets were empty. 40,000 people had gone to ground, into basements and shelters and anywhere that felt safer than being visible. And the silence of an empty colony is a specific kind of silence that sits differently than ordinary quiet. Their 4 ships came in low and fast on the southern side, using the mountain ridge as cover, landing in a flat field about 2 kilometers from the colony's edge. It was not a subtle approach, but it was a quick one, and Cole had explained on the way, and that quick mattered more than subtle at this particular moment. Kay stood in the cargo bay as the ramp came down and watched the 13 humans prepare. She had been in pre-battle spaces before. She had stood in staging areas with Iron warriors who had trained their whole lives for exactly this. And there was a particular quality to that preparation, focused, ritualized. Every warrior moving through their readiness process with the precision of something rehearsed and meaningful. Weapons checked in a specific order. Breathing exercises. The quiet words that warriors said to themselves or to each other that acknowledged the weight of what was coming. She looked around the cargo bay and tried to find that. A woman named Donna was sitting on an equipment crate eating a sandwich with the focused attention of someone whose main concern right now was finishing it before the ramp went down. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, average height, with short hair and the kind of arms that suggested she had been doing difficult physical things for a very long time. She caught Keith looking at her and held up the sandwich slightly, offering. Keith stared. Donna shrugged and kept eating. 2 men near the front of the bay, Ray and another one called Pete, were having an argument. Not a heated argument, just a quick, practical kind. Talking over a map of the colony's eastern district that Ray had pulled up on a handheld screen. Ray kept pointing at the flooded lower section near the river, and Pete kept shaking his head and pointing at a different route. And they went back and forth with the energy of 2 people who had argued like this before and were comfortable enough with each other that neither one felt the need to win, just to land on the best answer. A large, quiet man named Gary was in the corner doing equipment checks. He did not speak. He did not appear to need to. He went through his gear with the slow, methodical calm of someone folding laundry on a Sunday, item by item, thorough and unhurried. And when he was done, he stood up and was simply ready in a way that some people are just ready without making anything of it. The others were variations on this. Some checked weapons with the casual efficiency of people handling familiar tools. One was writing something on a small piece of paper, folding it, putting it in a pocket. Another was doing slow, deliberate stretches against the cargo bay wall. Not the dramatic kind, just the practical kind that a body needs before hard use. Nobody was performing anything. Nobody was building themselves up toward something. They were just getting ready the way you get ready for something you have done before and understand clearly. Keith walked over to Cole, who was going through his own case with quiet focus. "These are your warriors," she said. It came out less like a question and more like someone reading a sentence they were not sure they understood. Cole glanced up. "Retired people," he said. "There's a difference." "What is the difference?" He thought about it for a second. "Warriors fight because that's what they are," he said. "These people fight when it needs doing. Different thing entirely." He closed the case. Tend to make them harder to stop. She looked at Donna, who had finished her sandwich and was now checking her equipment with the same unhurried focus as everyone else, crumbs still on her jacket. She looked at Ray and Pete, who had apparently settled their argument and were now both looking at the map together, nodding. She looked at Gary, who was already watching the tree line through the open ramp with the still patience of something that had learned a long time ago how to wait. She did not fully understand what she was looking at yet, but she was beginning to think that she had been wrong about what she expected to see. The Kreth operation at Hargrove's Reach was, by any professional military standard, clean and well executed. 40 warships in orbit providing air superiority and the promise of escalation, if needed. Ground forces moving to the colony in organized formations, securing districts methodically, working outward from the communication tower they had taken in the first hour. It was a kind of operation that the Kreth ran regularly and had run successfully more times than anyone had officially counted. The formula worked because it was based on a principle that had proven itself over 2 centuries of engagements. Overwhelming force plus organized movement, plus the removal of communication, equals a population that has no options and knows it. The formula had one assumption built into it that nobody had thought to examine in a very long time. It assumed the other side would respond to overwhelming force the way most species did, which was to recognize it and adjust their expectations accordingly, to understand that the math did not work in their favor, to accept, with whatever grief that acceptance required, that the situation was what it was. The Kreth ground commander sent his first status report at the 40-minute mark. The language was professional and measured, the language of a commander who was mildly annoyed but not yet concerned. Unexpected resistance in the Northern District. Small groups, hard to pin down, moving in ways that did not match standard colonial defense patterns. Requesting additional tactical information about human military doctrine. At 90 minutes, the language had changed. Forces pulled back from the Eastern District to regroup and reassess. The resistance had not increased in size, which was a confusing part. The numbers were wrong. There were not enough of them to be doing what they were apparently doing. The ground commander requested clarification on whether additional human military assets had entered the operational area because the resistance did not match the profile of a colony defense force. No additional assets had been detected entering the area. The ground commander sat with that information for a while. At 2 hours, he sent a third report. It was shorter than the first two, 3 words in the Kreth military communication format that translated roughly as, "We are being hunted." What was happening in the streets and the flooded lower districts and along the eastern ridge was not a defense. A defense is when you hold a position and try to keep something from taking it. What was happening was something different, and the Kreth ground forces were finding it very difficult to describe in their normal reporting language because they did not have a category for it. Donna had looked at the flooded lower district the way a painter looks at a canvas. She had spent 11 years working in environments that conventional military forces considered too hostile and too unpredictable for standard operations, places where the terrain itself was as dangerous as the enemy, and she had learned things in those 11 years that did not fit neatly into any manual. The flooded district was not an obstacle to her. It was a tool. The Kreth soldiers, who had evolved in a world with low gravity and 2 moons and very flat terrain, did not handle unpredictable footing well. They were trained and disciplined and physically formidable and completely miserable in ankle-deep water with uneven ground beneath it. Ray knew Kreth armor in the specific way that comes from having spent years studying exactly one question, which was where it was weak. He knew the answer in the same way he knew his own name without having to think about it. He also knew that the Kreth, despite their reputation, had a particular difficulty with fast-moving situations that changed faster than their communication structure could process. Their formations were strong when they could maintain them. Disrupted, they were slower to reorganize than most people assumed. Pete had once held a mountain pass alone for 9 hours with minimal equipment against forces that significantly outnumbered him, and the eastern ridge above the colony had 3 positions that he identified within 10 minutes of looking at the map that were better than the pass had been. He was in the first one before the Kreth ground forces had finished their first sweep of the Northern District. Gary did not explain what Gary did. He had never explained it to anyone. He just moved through the operational area like weather, present and then not present, and things changed in ways that the Kreth found difficult to account for. Cole fought the way it fought in the arena, finding angles, turning advantages into problems, absorbing cost, and continuing. When a Kreth pulse weapon caught him in the left shoulder and burned through in a way that should have ended his participation in the day's events, he looked at it, pressed his hand over it, and kept moving. Kate was beside him when it happened. She stared. "How are you still?" "Adrenaline's a hell of a thing," Cole said, not slowing down. "Stay low." She stayed low. She had been told not to get in the way, and she had taken that seriously. But staying beside him, she was learning things that no combat exhibition had ever taught her. Not technique. Something underneath technique. The way these people made decisions. Fast and practical and without the half-second of pride or hesitation that she recognized in herself and in every warrior she had ever fought. They did not fight to win. They fought to finish. The distinction was small, and it was everything. At the 3-hour mark, the Kreth commander in orbit made a decision. It was a reasonable decision given everything he knew and everything he had been taught and the entire history of his empire's military record. The operation on the ground had encountered unexpected difficulty. The solution to unexpected difficulty was sufficiency of force. He had been operating with a force calculated for routine colonial pacification. He would correct that calculation. He called in reinforcements. 3 times the ships. 3 times the ground forces. Enough to make the situation simply stop being a situation. In a ruined building at the edge of the colony's eastern district, 13 humans sat among broken walls and breathed hard and bled various amounts, and someone passed around energy bars that had been at the bottom of a pack for an unknown period of time, but were eaten without complaint. Cole had a scanner. He looked at the incoming fleet on it, counted, looked up at his people. The grin started small, at the corner of his mouth, the same grin that had appeared in the arena after the cracked ribs, the one that meant something had been confirmed rather than something had gone wrong. Ray looked at the scanner, started grinning. Pete looked up from tightening something on his equipment, looked at the scanner, and something in his face settled into a calm that looked almost like satisfaction. Gary looked at the incoming fleet numbers and nodded once, slowly, like a man who has just been told that dinner will be ready soon. Donna looked at the scanner last. She had a half-eaten energy bar in one hand. She looked at the numbers for a long moment, looked at the others, and then looked back at the numbers. Well, she said, through a mouthful of energy bar. Now it's interesting. They won. Those two words do not carry enough weight on their own. They need context. They need the picture of what winning looked like, because it did not look like anything that most species would put in a painting or write a song about or use as a final image in a story meant to inspire people. It looked like Ray sitting against a broken wall with his right arm held at a wrong angle, having at some point during the third hour quietly taken that arm, positioned it against a doorframe, and shoved it back into the socket it had come out of without stopping what he was doing for more than about 15 seconds. He had 2 broken ribs as well, which he had not mentioned to anyone, and which were only visible in the way he breathed, carefully and shallow, like a man who has learned to work around pain by giving it less room to exist. When someone finally noticed and asked about it, he looked mildly annoyed at the interruption and said he had had worse. Donna would not let anyone near her back until it was done. The burn was significant, the kind that comes from a Kreth energy discharge at close range, and it covered most of the left side from shoulder blade to hip. She had known it was there from the moment it happened, and had made a decision in that same moment that she would deal with it when the situation was resolved, and not before, and she had held to that decision for the remaining 90 minutes of the engagement with a stubbornness that a Thyron warrior would have recognized and respected. When it was finally over, and she sat down and let someone look at it, she said only that it stung a bit, which was such a significant understatement that it briefly silenced the person treating it. Pete was conscious. This was, medically speaking, not a straightforward thing. He had taken a direct hit from a Kreth-heavy weapon in the final push of the engagement, the kind of hit that the Kreth used because it reliably ended the participation of whatever hit permanently and immediately. Pete had gone down. He had stayed down for approximately 4 seconds. Then he had gotten back up, which was not something the Kreth soldier who had fired had accounted for in any of his planning, and the expression on that soldier's face in the moment of seeing it was something that Pete would later describe, with quiet satisfaction, as extremely rewarding. Gary had a cut above his right eye from something sharp in the environment, not even from a weapon, just a general unfriendliness of moving fast through a damaged area in the dark. It bled the way head cuts bleed, which is dramatically and persistently, and in a way that looks much worse than it is. Gary had reached into a pocket, produced a strip of adhesive tape, pressed it over the cut, and continued. The tape was still there at the end, slightly crooked, still holding, still doing its job. Gary touched it once when someone pointed at it, checked that it was secure, and indicated with a small nod that the situation was handled. Cole had fought the entire last hour on a shoulder that had been burned through by a pulse weapon 60 minutes earlier. The human body is not supposed to be able to do that. There are very clear physiological reasons why a shoulder with that kind of damage should not be asked to continue working, and the shoulder had been presenting those reasons clearly and consistently for the full 60 minutes, and Cole had listened to all of them and continued anyway. When it was over, when the last Kreth ground unit had fallen back, and the signal came through that the orbital forces were withdrawing, he walked to a piece of broken wall at the edge of what had been a small park in the colony center and sat down on it. He sat down and he was tired. Kate had been beside him for most of the last 2 hours, and she had watched him closely, because she was the kind of being who watched things closely, and this was the first time since she had met him in that corner of the observation deck that she saw it. Not defeat, not pain, though the pain was clearly there, just the specific tiredness of a person who has spent everything they had, and is now sitting quietly while the account refills. He looked older than he had looked 2 hours ago. He also looked, In some ways, she did not have the right word for her, like a person who had done the thing they came to do and was at peace with that. The Kreth fleet withdrew, not a tactical repositioning, not a regrouping at a safer distance to reassess and return. The ships turned, and they left the space above Hargrove's reach, and they kept going, and the direction they went was away. And they did not stop. On the Celestial Accord Station, Lord Vorith received a communication from his fleet commander. He read it once, and then read it again, and then read it a third time, not because the words were unclear, but because his mind kept arriving at the meaning of them and then stepping back from it, because the meaning was not acceptable. 13 humans, against what he had sent. And the result was what the report was telling him it was. He sat very still for a long time after the third reading. The people of Hargrove's Reach came out of their shelters slowly at first, the way people emerge after something terrible has passed, carefully and with the specific attention of beings checking whether the world is still the same shape it was before, then faster, as the checking confirmed that the ships were gone and the streets were quiet, and the thing that had been happening was no longer happening. A child ran out a sheltered doorway toward a woman standing in the street who had been looking for her, and when they reached each other, the woman made a sound that was crying and laughing at the same time, the specific sound of relief that has nowhere else to go. Kaith watched it from 20 feet away and did not look away. She sat down beside Cole on his piece of broken wall. For a while, neither of them said anything, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. Around them, the colony was coming back to life in the careful way that things come back to life after being very close to not existing anymore. People checking on neighbors, voices calling names, and other voices answering. The ordinary sounds of 40,000 people discovering they were still here. "I don't understand," Kate said finally. She was not a being who said that often. She said it now because it was simply true, and she had decided that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. "Your species is physically weaker than 17 species I can name right now. You have shorter lives than almost everything in the galactic community. You sleep for a third of every single day, which is an extraordinary amount of time to be completely vulnerable. Your bodies break easily and heal slowly, and you feel pain from things that most species would not even register." Cole nodded. "Yep," he said. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The child and the woman were still holding each other in the street. "What are you?" Kay said. It was not quite a question. It was more like someone thinking out loud about a problem they had been turning over for a while. Cole looked up at the sky. The space where the Kreth fleet had been was just space now, ordinary and deep and indifferent. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing words carefully, not because the subject was sensitive, but because they wanted to get it right. "We're from Earth," he said. "You know what Earth is like." He did not wait for an answer. For the first few billion years of life on that planet, everything that existed spent all of its time trying to eat everything else. That was the whole project. Eat or be eaten. Every single day, no exceptions, no days off. Things that couldn't handle that stopped existing. Things that could handle it got better at handling it, and then found new things to handle and got better at those too. He paused. By the time humans showed up, the bar for what counted as a normal Tuesday was already extremely high. Surviving was an achievement. It was just the minimum, the floor. You survived, and then you figured out what you were going to do with the rest of the day. Kaith listened. "We're not the strongest species in the galaxy," Cole said. "We're not the fastest or the hardest to kill or the most physically impressive by any measure that a scanner would pick up. We know that. We've always known that. There's always been something bigger and something stronger and something with more arms or more armor or more of whatever quality you point to and say, that's what a real fighter looks like." He looked at his hand, the one he had been pressing against his shoulder for the last hour. "But the thing about Earth is that it never cared what you looked like. It just kept coming. And the only answer that ever worked, the only one that worked every single time over millions of years, was to keep going, to not quit, to find the next thing and deal with it, and then find the thing after that." He was quiet for a second. "We never learned how to quit. We've been trying to learn for a long time. We just can't figure it out." Kay thought about the arena, about the exact moment he had smiled after she hit him hard enough to crack ribs, the smile that had said something was confirmed rather than something was wrong, about 12 retired people in a cargo bay eating sandwiches and arguing about maps and checking equipment like it was a household task, and then going out and making a fleet twice their strength turn around and go home. She thought about the child in the street and the woman who was crying and laughing at the same time. She looked at her own four hands for a long while and said nothing. 3 days later, back on the Celestial Accord Station, there was a diplomatic reception in one of the upper-level event spaces. These things happened constantly at the festival. Small formal gatherings where ambassadors and officials ate food that was chosen to offend no one and said things that were chosen for the same reason. Kate attended because she was required to attend and stood at the edge of a conversation that was not interesting and held a glass she was not drinking from. A Thyron ambassador, one of the senior diplomatic staff, moved to stand beside her. He was careful and measured in the way that long-serving diplomats become, a being who had learned to ask questions that sounded casual while being precise. "Your Highness," he said, "the events at the human colony. I have been trying to form an assessment of the human species for my report. You were present. What would you say they are?" Kate considered the question with the full weight it deserved. "They are not warriors," she said. The ambassador looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected a different answer. No, she said. "A warrior is someone who is trained to fight, someone who has built their identity around the skill of combat and the culture that surrounds it. The humans at Hargrove's Reach were not that. They were retired. They were people who had other lives they had gone back to." She paused. "They fought because it needed to be done. That is a different thing entirely, and I would argue it is a more dangerous thing." The ambassador waited. "They are survivors," Kate said. "The oldest and most stubborn survivors this galaxy has produced. They come from a world that spent billions of years making things that were very good at not dying, and they are the thing that world made best." She picked up her glass and looked at it. "I would strongly recommend that no one give them a serious reason to remember that." The ambassador nodded slowly and wrote something in his notes, and moved away to find a more comfortable conversation. Across the station, in the same quiet corner of the same observation deck, Cole was at the same bar. His left arm was in a sling. His ribs were wrapped under his shirt. He had a bruise along his jaw that had developed over 3 days into a color that had no good name in most languages. He was nursing a drink and watching the stars through the viewport with the relaxed attention of someone who has nowhere to be and is fine with that. The bartender was a six-limbed Yosan named something that did not translate well, who had been working this particular bar for 19 years and had seen enough of the galaxy come through it that very little surprised him anymore. He had watched the emergency broadcast 3 days ago. He had followed what happened at Hargrove's Reach on the station news. He set a fresh drink down in front of Cole without being asked. "On the house," he said, "for what your people did." Cole looked at the drink and then at the bartender. "Appreciated," he said. The Yosan leaned against the bar. 19 years had made him comfortable with direct questions. "Are all humans like you?" Cole thought about Ray with his relocated shoulder, moving through the Eastern District at 3 a.m. like it was a mild inconvenience. He thought about Donna and her burn and her stubborn refusal to acknowledge it until the job was done. He thought about Pete getting back up. He thought about Gary and his strip of adhesive tape. He thought about 40,000 people who had walked out of their shelters into a street that was still theirs. "Nah," he said, "most of them are worse." He picked up the drink. Outside the viewport, the stars were doing what stars do, which is exist quietly and without comment for billions of years, indifferent to the small dramas of the species that looked up at them. Cole was fine with that. He had always been fine with that.